The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague, Nancy Hennessy. We're all here because we care about translating the research that we all strive to do into practice. And of course, it takes people to do that for us and help us with that. And if we don't have those people who are adept and skilled at understanding the research and then translating that, as Nancy has done through her work with Louisa Moats and developing the letters modules that help to train educators across this country, for the work that she's done to put a chapter in Judy Burch and Suzanne Yarker's book to help us understand the research base for effective instruction for the most severely impaired readers. If we didn't have her having led IDA, the International Dyslexia Association, and leading her to receive the Margaret Bird Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award, we wouldn't have the ability to be lifelong learners. Because to be a lifelong learner, we have to have people who are willing to walk with us and to show us how we take this research base and have the skill of adapting that to make it applicable. And of course, that comes from being able to walk the walk, from having been an educator, from having been an administrator. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Nancy Hennessy.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really so pleased to be here with you. I want to begin by thanking MTSU for inviting me, particularly Amy Elliman. I'm really humbled and honored by being a part of this conference, a Research to Practice conference. I'm also humbled by the presence of each of you, the participants, practitioners as well as researchers. There are so few opportunities for us to interact with one another, and this is critical for all of us to be thinking about and sharing with each other our experiences. I'm standing before you as a learner. I spent many, many years in public school, many years on the road, training and consulting, and most recently with a private school outside of Philadelphia that I'll mention, where I've done some direct work with teachers. I think that I've done my best learning when I've been in schools, when I've been able to take what it is that I've been learning about from those in the field actually to practice in the classroom. So hopefully I'll be able to share some of that with you today. I also want to share with you some of my thoughts about how do we move research into practice. What have my experiences over the years taught me? Of course, we're going to talk about comprehension. And we know that comprehension is quite complex. It's multidimensional in nature. It's not the easiest thing to take to practice. And I suspect that whatever we're doing today will be different tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. I find myself, as I'm sure all of you do, consistently reading and learning and changing my thinking about what will work best for students. Here's my hopes for today. My hopes is that you'll be able to reflect and connect on what it is that I have to say, and then to think a little bit about how you might act on that. I think it's very critical each time we come together in a learning situation that we leave with some kind of an idea of how we might use what it is that we've heard. In what ways does that connect to what I have to do every day, regardless of who we are and what our profession is. Of course, at the heart of what we do are our students. Each and every one of us do our work so that we can benefit others. And yes, we benefit ourselves through our learning. Each of us would not be in this room if we didn't like learning, right? But only by taking that learning to the next step, sharing it with others, our colleagues, right? And eventually with our students when we're practitioners in classrooms, can we make a difference. So my hope really is that all students will benefit from this discussion today, including those that struggle, that they'll have the opportunities to acquire and be capable of using the essential language and cognitive skills that are necessary for making meaning of text. Now you see in the lower right-hand corner of the screen a quote from Mark Seidenberg. I happen to be a fan of his latest book, right? And in that book, he talks about the fact that this country is a chronic underachiever, with good reason. We have results from assessments, such as the NAEP, from the PISA, that tell us that we just haven't quite yet met the mark, and that we need to do more so that our students are capable of not only reading words, absolutely critical, the on-ramp, they have to be able to read the words, but also make meaning of the text. When we think about those students, we can think about these varied students who come to school with different perspectives, different needs. And so I think about, for instance, Lily, who's being asked to work with text as a 9th grader that's complex in nature. I think about younger students who are being asked to perhaps work with text such as Tuck Everlasting, or the kindergartner who's listening to Frog Goes to Dinner, and so on. And we know that each and every one of those students comes with different capabilities. The task will be different, the demands are different, right? And so we have to be thinking about how we can help our students meet those challenges. We have to be flexible in our approach dependent upon what it is that we're asking our students to do. I really can never do a talk without bringing a student into the room. I think that's pretty critical for us as we think about our work. So in order for us to begin to think about connecting research to practice, we need a purposeful approach. And I want to talk about what I think is a purposeful approach based on some of my experiences. So in thinking about this, one, I think we have to think about building this relationship between research and practice, building the relationship between each and every one of us that are sitting in this room today. Here's a unique opportunity, right, to interact with researchers. Okay, I have to raise the mic just a little bit. We also have to think about the development of informed educators, right? And so thinking about the fact that we need to understand, right, what it is that we have to do. We have to have that information, that knowledge base, in order to be effective. We also need to be thinking about what do evidence-informed practices look like? And today I want to talk about a framework for comprehension that would encompass many of the strategies and activities, perhaps, that are used in classrooms today. We also have to consider the fact that we need informed instructional environments or educational environments. We can't accomplish change without support. We need leadership and organizational structures that allow for us to use those evidence-informed practices based on our knowledge base. And of course, I want to talk a little bit about what now, but actually that's your responsibility. That's your job, right? As I think about those students that I just talked about, practitioners are the context, right, in which our students learn. So again, hoping that you'll reflect, connect, and think a little bit about what might you do next. So let's move on then, and let's begin to talk about that first dot and make some connections to building relationships between research and practice. And unfortunately, there is a disconnect between the two. Now, many of you may have experienced something different because of where you are, because of this particular setting. But in general, when we work with practitioners, when we work with teachers across the country, right, what we see is a disconnect, a lack of opportunity to interact with researchers, a lack of opportunity to take what it is that they are learning and think about how it might apply to our own practices. Mark Seidenberg, profound disconnection between the science of reading and educational practice. That's not new information. The National Research Council spoke to this a number of years ago as well. So why is it that? Why is there this disconnect between research and practice? And Louisa Moats and others, such as Malt Joshi, Louise Spear-Swerling, and Cunningham, have all spoken to the fact that teachers do not always receive the knowledge that they need in their preparation programs in order to address the needs of the students that they meet in their classrooms. Right? So she talks about the fact that teachers may cling to unproductive philosophies because science-based instruction is neglected in many teacher preparation programs. She also talks about the fact that many of the concepts having to do with the design and delivery of informed instruction are elusive. They're difficult to grasp. I'll put my hand up and say, I love reading SSR articles, but boy, I have to read them several times before I understand them. All right. So that translation, even in terms of understanding that knowledge base, can be difficult for us. We need to think about ways to bridge that, to make the research more understandable for those of us that work in schools. And I know the researchers work hard at doing that. That's why you have this conference today. All right. This is a problem on many different levels. So it's not only teacher preparation programs that are culpable, but we can begin to think about the fact that we've had a lack of standards, for instance, that reflected the science of reading up until recently. Of course, the International Dyslexia Association has developed knowledge and practice standards for all teachers of reading. These provide guidance for us in terms of thinking about our practice. And of course, they're based in the science of reading. Right? We also can think about the fact that on state levels, very often, we have not had the support for the science of reading that's necessary. I recently read the National Council on Teacher Quality data burst that had to do with state-level assessments of elementary and special education teachers in terms of reading, and how well each state did in terms of looking at and asking participants, teachers, to respond to questions related to the science of reading. Most states are not doing what they need to be doing in terms of those teacher tests, right? I happen to live in North Carolina. North Carolina is one of the states that's meeting the criteria. But I have to tell you, it hasn't totally yet filtered down to all of the classrooms. Tennessee only partially meets the requirements, so there's still much work to be done, and I think we're all aware of that. All right, so I didn't mean to start with a downer, because there are glimmers of hope, and I can certainly speak to those as well. All right. Those glimmers of hope I've witnessed have been interactions such as today, but also in that setting in the private school that I mentioned, continual interaction with researchers such as Tim Odegaard, Amy Elliman, Don Compton, Hollis Scarborough, purposeful in nature, supported by the organization, supported by the leadership, allowing for these conversations that are so critical that we need to be having with each other. So I kept thinking about, after creating that slide that was a bit of a downer, what did my experiences tell me, and what was out there in terms of how do you move educational research into educational practice? And I went looking and reading, as usual, and found an article in the Canadian Journal of Education that Lysenko and colleagues published on this very topic, right? They looked at and interviewed, thousands of practitioners, asking them questions about what was getting in the way, what was the barrier in terms of moving research into practice, and what might be done in order to address that obstacle or that barrier. And they talked about this. Increasing the use of research-based evidence begins with developing positive attitudes about that the research actually can inform our practice. Among educators toward the utility of research, enhancing their expertise, so working directly with educators, not expecting that because we read an article we're able to automatically translate, but working together to enhance our expertise in terms of using what the evidence has to offer in a wise way, right? Efficaciously. Prompting awareness of research and then creating an organizational structure, and I think this is particularly important when we think about school setting, an organizational structure that supports evidence-based practice. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I've had the experience of working with teachers and working in settings where we knew what we should be doing, but the culture did not allow us to do it. And so thinking about how we become, in a sense, warriors, what I call sometimes tempered radicals, and advocating for what we know works for students, what will result in positive outcome for students. All right. So taking a different approach than what usually happens in terms of research to practice, more often than not, and we have this little cartoon, and he's saying we do things a little differently here. Development and research. No, we want to change that trend. We want to move from research to development, all right? And keeping in mind, this is a quote from Voice of Evidence, research is the only defensible foundation for educational practice. If not research, then what? And I think about this constantly because I think about my own experiences as an educator and what I relied on initially when I didn't really have the information or the knowledge base that I needed. And I relied on anecdote, I relied on past practice, sometimes I relied on intuition, my gut, all right? And sometimes we still have to do that because we don't necessarily know everything. But when we have the research, it's really indefensible not to use it. So thinking through how we can continue to build these connections with one another. So just think to yourself for a moment, what are some of the examples of those relationship building opportunities that you've had that you need to talk to others about and that you need to continue to pursue so that we work in partnership with one another? All right. So research to practice means research that is put into effect in practice according to a definite plan. So now let me talk a little bit about some plans here. So let's move then to informed educators, all right? So I think it's Louisa Moats that said something like this, you know, we cannot teach what we do not know, right? Well, we cannot teach what we do not know or understand. And when I think about being informed, I think about having a foundational knowledge that not only tells me what to do, but why I'm doing it. And so I think for each and every one of us, we need to be thinking about what are the theoretical models that can help initially guide us in our thinking about delivering instruction, whether that instruction be focused in the area of word recognition or whether it be focused in the area of language comprehension or reading comprehension. So I can't help myself. I have to start with the simple view, right? And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the simple view. We know that Goff and Tummer, right, a number of years ago, provided us with direction in terms of how an individual becomes a proficient reader, how an individual is able to come to text and make meaning. Right? Two factors that are involved, right? Although the simple view is not all that simple, we all know that. But two factors involved, initially word recognition, right? And then, of course, language comprehension. We know that the simple view has stood the test of time, although there are continued articles. Hugh Katz has a recent one in which he looks at, some of you may have read it, looks at the simple view and reaffirms what it has to offer, but also asks some serious questions about the simple view in terms of what perhaps it does not tell us or that we need to explore further. Right? But that simple view then giving us a base to work from, giving us some understanding that in order for our students to become proficient readers, they have to have word recognition capabilities. I often think of that as the on-ramp, right? And that in order to make meaning, they have to have language capabilities. And they need to bring those together to the task, right? And use them in order to construct meaning. I'd be remiss if I didn't also talk about the reading rope. And some of you may be thinking, why is she talking about this? Everybody knows about the simple view. Everybody knows about the reading rope. Well, I have to tell you, I've talked with many, many educators over the years, continue to do that, and many do not know the simple view. Many do not know the reading rope. I'm astounded sometimes when I say to a group, we're going to talk about the reading rope this evening or this afternoon, and would you just tell me whether or not you've seen this before? And I expect that every hand is going to go up in the audience, and it doesn't always happen, right? So what is the reading rope? Well, we know it's a metaphor for proficient or skilled reading. We know that it was designed and developed by Hollis Scarborough. Back in the late 90s, Hollis, in an attempt to explain the complexity of reading to parents and educators, designed the reading rope. Later on, she published an article in the Handbook of Early Literacy Research in which the reading rope appeared, and she discussed right? These connections between language and literacy, language and being at risk for reading failure. She basically deconstructed for us the simple view. She provided us with an explanation of those factors that contribute to word recognition and those factors that contribute to language comprehension that need to be developed independently and interdependently, and how they work together over time. Notice there's an arrow across the bottom. That's in addition to the reading rope. This is a slide that Hollis was generous enough to share with me, right? That these capabilities, right, these skills, these sub-skills, language sub-skills, develop over time, and they develop from the perspective of automaticity and strategically. Right, so she gave us a gift that allows for us to begin to think about what should I be addressing in terms of understanding how students come to reading. Of course, she developed the reading rope based on the simple view and based on a meta-analysis, 61 years of research, looking at studies that had to do with early predictors of being at risk for reading failure. Right. So very solid work that we continue to use today. I'm particularly interested this morning, as I think you are, in the upper strands of the rope, right? The upper strands of the rope having to do with language comprehension, having to do with, all right, if we can read the words, right, what is it that we need to have in place in order to make meaning? Or if we're listening to the words, because many of our students don't yet have access to text, if we're listening to the words, what language capabilities, what are these sub-skills that we have to have in place in order to make meaning? So I've given away a little bit about my thinking now about comprehension, this multidimensional construct, by focusing on these upper strands of the rope and using the terminology language sub-skills. And in fact, when I think about comprehension, I think about it from a language perspective. Not so long ago, Rick Wagner and colleagues published an article, I think in the Journal of Learning Disabilities, in which they questioned whether we should call reading comprehension difficulties reading comprehension or language comprehension difficulties. Right? And this quote, I think, also conveys the importance of the language processes and skills that go into comprehension. So comprehension is a complex task. Well, I think we all know that, right? That involves a range of language and cognitive processes and skills. And the reading rope provides direction for us in terms of what some of those language processes and skills actually are, that students must master in order to make sense of written text. Now, I also want to say this about comprehension, right? Oftentimes we think about it as the extraction and construction of meaning, and it certainly is that, right? But I think we also have to think about it from a product process point of view. More often than not, all right, in school setting, we think about the products of comprehension. And I think that's critical, given that we have standards we have to meet, given that students have to be able to demonstrate their understanding, right? But at the same time, we need to consider the fact that without processes, we don't have products. And so a focus on process, a focus on those upper strands of the rope, a focus on some of the processes that others, such as Kate Kane and Perfetti, have identified, are important for us to be thinking about as we design intervention and instruction. Our assessment is all based on product. But the reality is we need to put in place these processes, right, that allow for the reader to arrive at the product. Just a little bit more on what I think informed educators need to be thinking about in order to answer the question, why? Why am I doing this? Why does my comprehension instruction look like this? Kate Kane, comprehension of written text involves processing language at many different levels. At the word level, the reader must decode individual words. Yes, that's the on-ramp, as I said. We need to be able to work with the words and read the words. But they also have to be able to access the meaning of the words that they hear or read. Are you beginning to make some connections to the strands of the rope? Vocabulary. So they have to have knowledge of word meaning. At the sentence level, the comprehender needs to work out the syntactic structure and sense of each sentence. Again, let's make a connection back to that reading rope. Language, structures, semantics, and syntax. I happen to really love talking about sentence comprehension. I think it's an underutilized, underemphasized part of reading comprehension. Sorry, that's just a little, I did a little bird walk there in terms of my own personal interests. All right. Okay, so we're seeing how these strands of the rope come together, how these language processes need to come together in order for the student to make meaning. In order to construct a mental model of the text, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, the comprehender needs to integrate information from different sentences. So tying up the meaning within and between sentences, using cohesive ties, pronoun reference, and so on. To establish local coherence and to incorporate background knowledge. Here comes the background knowledge part of the rope. And what are we using our background knowledge for? All right, more often than not, to make inference. Okay. So background knowledge and ideas retrieved from long-term memory to make sense of details that are only implicitly mentioned. Now, when I read that quote, and I've heard Kate Kane speak, I kept thinking about how can I make connections not only to the reading rope, right, but how can I make connections to practice? What does this mean in terms of that interaction that occurs between the reader and the text? And so I'm not particularly adept at visual images, but here's my attempt, right? So I tried to put into graphic form what Kate Kane was expressing, these different levels of language processing. So thinking about the fact that you have to make meaning of the words. So as students work their way through text, we have a student in the upper right-hand corner, and she's reading a placard, and it happens to have everything to do with dinosaurs, right? And we have a stack of books on the left representing the text itself, all right? So we know that there's this dynamic interaction that's occurring between the reader and the text. It's also shaped by what the task is. Here, the task happened to be self-imposed. She was just interested in dinosaurs. But it could have been that she was on a field trip and the teacher said to her, you need to read those different placards, all right, on dinosaurs, and then you need to write a summary, or you need to do a retell in terms of what it is that you've learned, all right? But what does she need to bring to the text and to the task in order to make sense out of it? Well, she needs to bring her understanding of words and phrases. And from an instructional point of view, she needs to understand academic vocabulary. Not the vocabulary of everyday language, but the more sophisticated vocabulary that we find in school in texts, right? She also has to work with the sentences that are presented to her. So how does the text present itself? Well, some of the sentences might be quite dense, meaning they have many, many different ideas, right? Well, here comes sentence comprehension, right? Right? Some of the sentences may be very, very long. She'll have to parse them, right? Maybe taxing on working memory. The structure of the sentences will be different. Simple, compound, complex all convey different types of logical relationships. She needs to understand that. And then here come those cohesive ties and connectives that tie up meaning within and between sentences, things like pronoun reference or connectives themselves. You might want to call them conjunctions and so on. In addition to that, Kate says to us, or speaks to us, she and her colleague Jane Oakhill speak to us about the importance of background knowledge. And so thinking about the fact now that when we come to text, we have to bring specific knowledge of what it is that we're reading as well as some general world knowledge. And that knowledge will allow for us to do what? To make inference, right? To go below the surface of the text, to understand what it is that the author is conveying. So in the words of Walter Kinch, we work at the surface code, we work at the text base, and hopefully what we do is we create mental models. A mental model being a coherent representation of the text. In other words, at the surface code, we're using the exact words that the author provided. We're using the vocabulary, we're using the syntax, right? The text base, the author assumes that we're going to bring some knowledge. The author can't provide all of the information to us. So we have to make connections with what the author intended for us to take away. And then the mental model is this accumulation of, this intertwining of the text base, our background knowledge, the successive phases of making meaning, this aggregate, all right, representation of what the text itself had to convey. And that's our hope for all our students, not that they work at this literal level, but they work at an inferential level, and they carry away with them this coherent representation, this mental model of the text. Hopefully you're going to carry away a different mental model this morning of comprehension, research to practice. You came with one model, and hopefully we're adding to that model this morning. All right. Now, I didn't want to overlook cognitive processes, and certainly I could be talking here about executive functions. I didn't want you to think I forgot about them, all right? And actually, I think I have to talk more with Hollis about this. I mentioned it last night with Amy and Tim. I think on that upper part of the rope where she talks about being strategic, right? She actually has explained that that means having a purpose, organizing, working toward this creation of a mental model. So being strategic, right? Well, that somewhat represents for us executive function, but we can break this down a little bit further and we can talk about the importance of working memory, the importance of cognitive flexibility, the importance of planning and organizing. Time just doesn't allow for us to talk about all aspects of this, but I think, again, we need to look at the research, and as practitioners, we need to understand the whys of why students either are very good at comprehension or not so good, right? What are the underlying reasons? Judith Irwin, though, by the way, represents some of what she considers the cognitive processes involved in reading comprehension. And these would include microprocesses where we're working with just idea units, and then integrative processes in which we're integrating the ideas within and between sentences. And then, of course, these processes that are metacognitive. So that comprehension monitoring that's so important, that oftentimes is lacking in comprehenders. And then moving to elaboration or elaborative processes in which we're integrating our background knowledge and building toward this overall understanding. So she's a practitioner who's taken some of the research and translated it for us, and I thought that might be helpful. Okay. So keeping in mind then, informed educators, my belief is we need to build basic foundational knowledge of what comprehension is about. And this is just a little bit of it, all right? Moving from theoretical models and thinking about what are the connections then to what happens in the classrooms? What's happening in the mind of the reader? What's happening in terms of how the text presents? What's happening from the perspective of what the task is, right? And then the context, providing the instructional context. So construction occurs moment by moment as the reader proceeds through the text within the conditions set by the text and the content. All right. Well, let's move on to another aspect of the plan. Let's now talk about evidence-informed instructional frameworks. So I'm going to now take you to something that I've designed and I've been using with practitioners over the last several years, a blueprint for organizing comprehension instruction. Now, this is not a lesson plan. It's not a unit organizer, right? Rather, it's a framework. It's like a master plan. Because when I step back from comprehension and I think about it, there's so many different aspects to it and so many different strategies and activities that we can use. And the research keeps bringing forward effective ways, for instance, of working with inference or working with vocabulary or sentence comprehension. But how do we step back from that and think about that in a more global way so that we're certain as we work with students I represented at the beginning, all right, Lily or Will or whomever, right, that as we work with them, we're addressing their needs in a flexible way, but a way that accommodates for what we know goes into comprehension, a multi-dimensional construct. Complex, not unitary. Okay. So the blueprint that I've designed is based on the reading rope. So it's based in evidence. It's based also in some of the work of Kate Kane and Jane Oakhill. It is intended to guide and support educators, so not to not to provide, as I said, a lesson plan, as they identify learning goals, set purpose, organize instruction, select instructional strategies and activities, and monitor student progress. So it's big picture. Okay. Here's a little bit more information about it. So I've already said it's evidence-based. I've already said it organizes and scaffolds. It's intended to be used in a flexible way. It calls for the use of evidence-based strategies and activities, right? And it acknowledges the metacognitive nature of teaching and learning. In a moment, I'm going to show it to you, but there's a number of questions that we pose that teachers can be asking themselves as they prepare text. So there's the blueprint, okay. So let's just take a moment to reflect on it, all right? What we see running along the left-hand column, right, are some topics that teachers need to be thinking about and asking themselves about as they prepare text, right? So it begins with critical understanding of text, right? And then it certainly moves to purpose for reading, and then it moves to text reading itself. And what you see under text reading is very representative of what you saw in the strands of the reading rope, very representative of what I just talked about in terms of levels of language processing. You'll see also that it indicates that as you think about developing these varied aspects of language processing and cognitive skills, right, that this work can be done before, during, or after reading. Again, dependent upon the student, dependent upon the text, dependent upon the task. And then we have a series of questions that we ask the teacher, the practitioner, the clinician to ask themselves, right, as they work through preparing to design and deliver instruction based on a particular text. Today does not allow for me to go into every aspect of that blueprint, but I want to share some components of it with you, because I think that, you know, when we come to designing and delivering instruction, we need to have some kind of a framework. We need to have some kind of a master plan that goes beyond just a specific isolated skill. We need to understand how all of these things work interactively with one another, right? And in fact, sometimes when we ask a question that we think is designed specifically for meaning, vocabulary for instance, it also relates to sentence structure, right? Because it might be a question that has to do with grammar, you know, the who and the do, for instance, a noun or verb. That's a part of meaning for vocabulary. So these strands of the rope are very interactive, and oftentimes, as we work through the blueprint, we see that there's overlap. Okay. So I want to go first to critical understandings. Okay. So when we prepare text, when we get ready to use text, whether it's multiple texts or one, we should be thinking about what is it that we want our students to be able to do with that text? What do we want them to know, right? So critical understandings has everything to do with a synthesis of what individuals should understand, not just know or do, as a result of reading, studying a particular content area. We also want to be thinking about what's the essential knowledge base we want to develop within and across grades and disciplines. I know very often we get focused on just English language arts, just reading, but I think we need to be thinking about developing knowledge across discipline, right? And I think, in fact, when we consider curriculum development and even the text that we have students reading, they need to connect up in an interdisciplinary way so that our students develop a deeper knowledge base, right? So the question we might ask is, are there critical concepts and understandings that we want our students to have? And I have an example for you. So I've mentioned my work with AIM Academy outside of Philadelphia. And a number of years ago, one of the things that we did at AIM was relooked the curriculum. And we relooked it from the perspective of comprehension. But not just comprehension in the ELA or in the English or reading class, but comprehension across disciplines, science, social studies, math. We thought a little bit about, not a little bit, we thought a lot about what were the concepts, what were the ideas, the big ideas that ran through the themes that ran through some of these different disciplines that we might then address specifically in reading and the English language arts class, but also, you know, encourage those teachers who were delivering math, science, social studies to do the same. right? We brought a group together. We took a look at the standards, Pennsylvania standards, Common Core standards. We looked at the core knowledge curriculum. Some of you may be familiar with that, E.D. Hirsch, right? We looked at what we were currently doing, right? And from that, we developed this comprehension curriculum specific to, all right, specific to the reading classes, the English language arts classes, but encompassing ideas from those other disciplines. And so for each year of study, the teachers identified 3 to 4, usually no more, units of instruction that were based on a big idea or a critical understanding. And then they identified the readings that would go along with that. Right. So this is an example from 4th grade. And what's the big idea? Well, the topic is revolutionaries. Right? And so the teachers come together, have conversation about revolutionaries, have conversation about what text they might use, and begin to generate some ideas about what do they think are the critical understandings. And you can see the one that they landed on at the very end. We can learn a variety of life lessons from revolutionaries. But look at how rich that discussion was in terms of what does it mean to be a revolutionary? What does revolution mean? Right? So this was their big idea or their critical understanding. We can learn a variety of life lessons from revolutionaries. Well, that then leads us, all right, to thinking about, well, what text then will we use? What might we identify that will allow for students across, maybe not necessarily in the math, science, or social studies class, but sometimes it could occur, right? But right there in the reading class, in the ELA class, what text could we occur that kind of went across disciplines that were a different genre that would give our students a good sense of what it meant to be a revolutionary and how you can learn life lessons. And so the next thing they had to think about was the choosing of the correct or the right readings. So they asked themselves questions. What readings reflect this knowledge base, the critical understandings identified? Will the reading provide opportunities to develop language processes and skills? Because in this particular school, in every classroom, the reading rope is up on the wall. It guides their instruction. So they're well versed in it, right? So will it provide opportunities to develop those processes and skills, but also academic language, a focus on the language of school? So keep in mind, this is a school that is for students with dyslexia. Not all these students are reading where they need to be reading immediately. They learn to read though, right? But if they in fact can't read the text, then access is provided to the text. So have you considered access issues for struggling readers? A firm belief that we give students opportunity for age and grade appropriate materials so that they build the vocabulary and knowledge base that is necessary for dealing with academic texts as they move through the grades. We also came up with a series of questions, all right? Again, this metacognitive aspect for comprehension for teaching. Will these readings develop the identified enduring understandings? Will these readings provide opportunities? And so on. All right, here's an example then of some of the readings that these teachers coming together identified. And some of these may be familiar to you. Now, I know that you don't always have the opportunity to identify your own readings, but there is an opportunity to identify perhaps additional readings, read-alouds that you can use with your students that focus on particular themes, topics, understandings. We also know that there is curricula out there that does this, core knowledge curricula, for instance, and we know there are materials, Wit and Wisdom series, for instance, recently published. So there's more and more attention being paid to the importance of knowledge, and Don Compton certainly and his colleagues talk about reading comprehension as what? An accumulation of knowledge across texts and from listening. And I think that's important for us to be thinking about, that it is not just that we're selecting our texts to work with skills. We do need to work with skills, but we are selecting our text and using our text to build knowledge, to build vocabulary, to build knowledge, which are critical to comprehension. Now, the third aspect of using something like the blueprint, you're prepping the text, you're thinking about your critical understandings, you're thinking about choosing your texts, all right? Again, all aligning with the evidence, aligning with what we know is effective for our students, all students, including those who struggle, right? We also have to think about evidence-based strategies. So for some of you who are sitting there thinking, she has not said a word about strategies, and I use strategies in my classroom. I am not anti-strategy. But we have to be thinking about, for what purpose are we using those strategies, right? And for me, it's always the question of why. So when I work with teachers, I love what they do. I love every time I walk into a classroom because I learn, right? And I know they're well-versed in what they're doing, but they're not always as well-versed in answering this question: why are you doing that? How does that connect to what it is that we know about how students actually make meaning of text, right? So a few words about strategies. I really like this quote from McNamara. The underlying assumption is that processes or skills induced by strategies become more automatic with practice. So strategies becoming more automatic and resulting in these skills, these processes that are so necessary to making meaning. The strategies lead to skills that become automatic and quick over time. So again, I think we have to be asking ourselves questions about whatever strategies we're choosing. If we think about those different levels of language processing, if we think about working with, vocabulary, sentence comprehension, background knowledge, questioning at different levels of understanding, and then expression of understanding, we have to be thinking about how those strategies directly align with the development of those skills and processes. All right. So I thought it would be helpful then if I just provided, because you must be thinking, wow, this is a lot of professional learning. Yes, it is. Remember I said learning is our work, or if I didn't say it, I should have. Learning is our work. It's not just the work of our students, it's our work as well. And it really never ends. It never ends for us. So thinking about if we're using something like the blueprint, it means that we have to be well-versed in each one of the components of that framework. Well-versed in each one of the different language processing skills, cognitive capabilities that students have to have when they have to interact with text. Okay. So when I work with teachers, we work our way through in a very systematic and a structured way over time through each of these components. We answer the questions. We answer questions that have to do with teaching vocabulary. How and when will I both intentionally and incidentally, because we can't teach all of the vocabulary words, right? How and when will I incidentally and intentionally teach words? When and where will that happen during instruction? How will I teach students, independent word learning strategies, things like morphology and context and so on? Where and when will I be doing that? Which words will I choose out of the text that I'm using for intentional, incidental, and independent word learning strategies? All right. So when I work with practitioners, again, I'm using the evidence that's there on a particular topic, on vocabulary, and I'm working with practitioners making connections to how do we define vocabulary? What's the research base? Why are we so interested in it? Why is it critical that we include it in our instruction? Are there routines, strategies, activities that we know are supported by the research? And so each one of these aspects of the blueprint is addressed in that way, right? Beginning with, definition. So up here in the right-hand corner, we have a little guy, and he's asking a question about, well, what exactly is vocabulary? Yeah, I have to learn that in school. What is that? And below, I've indicated it has everything to do with breadth, depth, and fluency. So when we teach words, we need to understand that we're teaching words for recognition, breadth of vocabulary. Some words we're teaching for depth. Students own the words, they know everything about them. More often than not, those are the words that we address intentionally in our instruction. And those words are the words that we tend to be able to surface rather automatically, that we have access to, that we're fluent in. Different use of the word fluency than we typically think about. All right. We also need to be thinking about, here's the answer to the why again. Why are you doing that? Well, here's Perfetti and Adloff saying successful comprehension depends on accessible, well-specified, and flexible knowledge of word forms and meaning. So this ability to make connections between the representation of the word, the phonology, the orthography, and the meaning of the word, or meanings, right? And that children with better vocabulary knowledge have higher reading comprehension scores concurrently and longitudinally. So we have to address vocabulary. Okay. What about approaches then? You know, I said definition, I said research, and then I said something about frameworks or routines or approaches. Well, here's a graphic that represents 3 approaches to word learning. Again, based on the literature, based on what we know works, right? In my words, right? So we have, first of all, intentional on-purpose instruction, right? So those are the words we're choosing to directly, explicitly teach, okay? And what does that involve? Well, it means you have to know something about word choice. So how are you choosing your words, all right? You need some kind of a routine to introduce those words, and then you need to work with those words and their meanings. So you need multiple strategies and activities. How about incidental on-purpose language experiences? Because this is how most of us learn our words, right? So this might be through what? Through teacher talk, through student talk, through read-alouds, incredibly important, right? Through point of contact discussions. That's a Stephen Stahl terminology in which when we come to the word in text, we provide a synonym or a quick explanation for the word. I'm sure many of you do that when you're working with vocabulary. Discussions, and then independent reading, structuring up independent reading. And then last but not least, intentional independent word learning strategies, teaching kids how to use the context. Not all contexts are equal. You have to teach them how to use the context. Morphology, wow. Latin and Greek forms, think how many words those unlock. And then, of course, the good old dictionary. Now, coupled with this framework, we also know that we need to use certain routines. And I've already mentioned the fact that when we're directly, explicitly teaching kids, we can use a routine. The routine should include definitional and contextual information. The literature tells us that. So student-friendly definitions, but also the word used in context. Kids need multiple exposures to targeted words. They need deep engagement, lots of processing for words to become theirs. So here I'm talking about depth of knowledge. And multiple varied opportunities before, during, and after. So again, here's a simple routine that I've used with teachers that when I'm working with the blueprint we talk about, it's not so different than many of the routines that you find in the literature. It accommodates for the phonology, the orthography, and the meaning of the word, the connections that we can build between those 3 systems. So the student listens to the word, discusses the structure of the word before they see the word. Now, they may have seen it before, but in your introduction, you want them listening and thinking about the phonology of the word. You want them repeating the word, then you define, here's the definitional, all right? And then you want to also provide examples or context. And then you want your students to see, say, and write the word so they see the orthography of the word, all right? And I have a small example here, one of the books that came from that revolutionary unit from AIM Academy. One of the books is Dear Benjamin Banneker, and that's just an example of a few of the words because teachers work together to identify those words that they're going to directly, explicitly teach. And they made some decisions on these words: activists, revolutionaries. Well, that's not surprising, even though that word is not used in the text, but they need an understanding of it, and injustice. And how did they decide? Well, they used criteria such as growth, usefulness. Some people might use, the tiers, Beck's tiers. Some people may be familiar with B. Miller's research and so on, but you have to be thinking about how am I going to make good decisions about these words? All right, just one more thing here. Additionally, all right, remember I said something about those multiple exposures? Well, word learning is incremental, it's interrelated, it's multidimensional. So it's not just enough to do this first column, all right, where we have word choice, and those are just some different examples I've put together for educators, because guess what? Different people will use different approaches. These are all found in the literature, all right? Definitions can be done in different ways, and I've given some examples here. when I talk with teachers about different ways to present definitional information. But then we come to that deep processing or working with words, and here it's categorized under semantic, relationships, connections, visuals, and then speaking and writing activities. So in thinking about the blueprint, and thinking about a framework for teaching comprehension, here's just one little aspect, although a very important one, that we need to focus on. And look how complex it is. So I started off by saying comprehension, multidimensional. Comprehension, complex. It's a challenge. It's not just about reading a story and asking questions, is it? It's much more than that. It's thinking about where are your students at? What does the text demand, right? And what's the task that I'm asking them to participate in? What should I focus on? You don't necessarily focus on every aspect of the blueprint every single time, right? But you're cognizant of the fact that sometimes it will require more direct instruction than other times for particular aspects, or more practice or reinforcement, warm-up activities, for instance, so that these students are developing all the strands of the rope, not just one, but all those upper strands of the rope. These all contribute to comprehension. It's also a way of thinking about why do kids struggle, right? I think Kate Kane talks a great deal about students who are poor comprehenders typically struggle with that integration of information, the integration of information within and between sentences, and then the integration of background knowledge. They also struggle with comprehension monitoring. They also struggle with story structures, not just narrative text, but expository text. So there are different places where the breakdown can occur, right? If I were thinking about Kinch's theory, it could be at the surface code, the text base, or the mental model. If I'm thinking about the strands of the rope, it could be in any one of those strands of the rope. So again, this is not so easy. It's why we need to be consistently thinking about how do we take what the research is telling us, move it into practice, and we primarily do that through learning, through professional learning. So when I think about professional learning, this is a part of it, right? But it's much, much more than that, right? It's a continuum of learning opportunities that allow us over time to become more and more expert in what it is that we do. Okay, so a definite plan. So I've talked about building research to practice relationships, the importance. I've talked about the importance of us being informed educators, beginning with theoretical models, and then thinking through, what it is that we understand, not just know, but understand about comprehension itself. And then I think about, can I design a framework for myself? Can I come up with a way of thinking about developing all of those processes and skills, particularly language processes and skills, that go into making meaning, and at the same time considering the read of the text, the task, right? And then, of course, last but not least, are these informed educational environments. So some of you may be familiar with the implementation science, or with implementation science in the research. And out of the National Implementation Research Center comes information about how do we put innovation or practices in place and sustain them. Because one of the problems, of course, for all of us in this field is that we often have wonderful, wonderful programs, approaches we put in place, and whoever the leader was, or if there's only one or two leaders, that goes away after time. And so implementation science talks about certain drivers that are really critical in terms of implementing and sustaining innovation. And for me, that means taking research into practice. So it would include building staff confidence, having the organizational structures that are necessary to support educators and to sustain the practices, and then, of course, having in place leadership. And we all know that when we're faced with many challenges, or too many challenges, we often discard new knowledge and we go back to what it is that we've been doing. It's easy to revert back into practice if we don't have these kinds of supports. So I had an opportunity a number of years ago to write what I considered the the heart of professional learning for AIM Academy. And it really came out of my knowledge base from public school, because the last position I had in public school, I was a director of professional development, right? And in that role, I learned a great deal about adult learning and what it takes for adults to be able to move, right, good practice into practice. And so this is something that I wrote a number of years ago, but I think it really gets at the heart of what's necessary for us to put into place research, to put into place effective practice. And so a meaningful professional learning culture that provides access to researchers and practitioners. So having opportunity to interact, whether that be through conference, whether that be through workshop, whether that be through partnerships, research projects, and so on, but having access to one another. And then providing a continuum of real and virtual learning opportunities, right? So more and more, we're using the web for learning opportunities, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. So in person as well as virtual, but a continuum. So not just talking heads, not just a talk by someone such as myself, but opportunities to engage in conversation, in curriculum development, in research projects, in coaching, in mentoring. So this whole continuum that's necessary in order for us to be thinking about how to move these practices into place. So access to experts, professional communities of practice, literacy mentors and coaches, and varied opportunities. So I have just a couple of minutes to say what I want to say about this. So access to experts. So I'll use some examples. At AIM Academy, for instance, we have a research symposium every year. It's free. You all can go online and access it. It's this March 11th, I believe, right? And we bring researchers to our community, but also to the larger educational community in the Philadelphia area, so that they have access to what are the trends, what's happening with research in different areas. This year, the focus happens to be reading and math connections, right? We also can think about inviting researchers in, or researchers inviting practitioners in. And I've seen wonderful examples of that also at AIM Academy, where we've had research projects, for instance, involving Amy and Don Compton and others. I know Tim Odegaard is on our research advisory board and consistently is providing feedback. So access to, right, really thinking about becoming colleagues, all right? Tempered radicals together, maybe, all right? Secondly, thinking about professional communities of practice. So I don't know if any of you have participated in professional communities of practice, but this is something that I've been doing recently where I can't necessarily get to where all of these individuals are, but we can set up some learning opportunities together. And so I've been doing a series of webinars on particular topics, but they're always preceded by a get ready. So there's reading or learning that occurs beforehand. That then does what? It facilitates participation, right? And there's always a reflect and connect. So some kind of assignment, but it's an assignment that directly connects to whatever that individual is doing. So this continuum. We also can talk about mentoring. Some of you may be literacy coaches or mentors. We can talk about using the implementation science to support coaching individuals. For instance, that blueprint, there's a classroom fidelity checklist that goes along with that blueprint, like a walkthrough. But how is that used? It's not used for accountability. It's not evaluative. It's used to provide direct feedback to colleagues, right? To the individuals that you're working with, to identify what else do you need to learn? Or what have I learned from observing in your classroom? So it's used as a basis for professional learning, right? And then these other opportunities include curriculum development, which I mentioned, I described for you, but there's many different opportunities we can seize. Also participation in research projects. I'm currently working with a group of educators on informal comprehension assessment, a chart looking at how else might we assess comprehension. We certainly recognize the importance of norm reference tests, but the reality is they can't tell us everything. And we want direct feedback on what's happening in the classroom. So can we take classroom activities? Can we base them on the blueprint, right? And can we kind of deconstruct for ourselves where students are having difficulty, right? So that we can intervene, all right, and provide, when necessary, intensive instruction. So multiple opportunities, I think, that we can provide. And then, of course, there's the what's next or what now. And that's really up to you, all right? What are you taking away? What did I say that perhaps you went, ooh, I do that. I'm going to keep doing that, right? Maybe I could try that. Maybe I want to investigate that a little bit more. Maybe there's something that I can do in terms of making a connection. And so I'll just come back to this quote that I used at the beginning, sort of as my framework for thinking about if we want to build these relationships with one another, then I think we have to be thinking about developing positive attitudes. It's a two-way street, not just among educators, I think. Thinking about enhancing our expertise, thinking about the utility of what the evidence, what the research has to share, and then thinking about what organizational structures are necessary to provide effective instruction. Okay, so this is what we started with, and this is where we're ending. And let me go here, because I'm at the very end of my time. And this little guy, or guys, they're standing outside the teacher's lounge, and they're talking about some sort of support group going on in there. Could be the researchers' lounge as well, I think, right? We all need support. We all need one another. That's the reality. We cannot, this comprehension is way too difficult for us to tackle on our own. So we need the courage to start and continue what we should do, and the courage to stop what we shouldn't do. All right, and I thank you so much for being so attentive this morning.